Thank you, everyone, today for joining us. My name is Stephen Shaya. I'm Executive Servant Leader at J&B Medical, our family-owned business, and also Managing Director of Akkad Holdings, which is my family office. And I have the honor and privilege today of having three distinguished guests, and we're here to talk about the challenges and opportunities around the global supply chain. So let me first start with Dan Messina, who's the CEO of Hands Free Health. He's been a longtime healthcare entrepreneur. He's doing a lot around manufacturing, around hardware and software, and he's going to talk a little bit about what he's been dealing with. I have our Mr. Supply Chain, Daniel Stanton, and he's literally Mr. Supply Chain because he's an author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies, and he's a talking head on TV and newspapers, and so we're excited to have him. And then we have Roscoe Carney, who's a supply chain expert for Shell Oil Company, which we think is appropriate because we're in the Middle East, and certainly supply chain issues run the gamut through all industries and all sectors and affect our lives. So I'd first like to start with Dan Messina to give a little more in-depth background about yourself, and then we'll go to Daniel and then Roscoe. So Dan, maybe you could start us off, and I didn't do justice, so I just wanted to tee it up, and please share a little bit more about your background.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today with everyone. I also want to thank you. You promoted me to CEO. I'm actually the president. My co-founder wouldn't appreciate that if he knew I took over his job. But I am the president and the co-founder of Hands Free Health. It is a virtual health voice platform. We deliver that platform in different fashions through a smart speaker, a watch, a pendant, and also through an app. And so we are dealing obviously with supply chain issues associated with that. Previously, I had been a partner with Health Advocate, which was a company which we started in 2001. Began with just 6 employees, and by the time we sold it, we had over 1,000 employees, 44 million members. We were nationwide, and a nice success story. And beyond that, my career includes being the CEO of Magellan Health Services, the CFO of Aetna Healthcare, and various different other roles with Cigna, Aetna, et cetera.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan, for that, and congratulations on all your successes.
Thank you.
Let's go to Mr. Supply Chain, Daniel.
For sure. Stephen, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I appreciate the introduction, and you hit a bunch of the high points. So I did my master's in supply chain at MIT many, many years ago. Spent some time working in industry, really kind of took a turn, and my focus over the last several years has been around supply chain education. So as you mentioned, I am the author of Supply Chain Management for Dummies. I've got supply chain courses up on LinkedIn Learning that have been viewed by around 1 million people around the world. And, you know, in addition to, or as a part of my role as an educator, one of the things I do is I'm a supply chain futurist for IBM, helping them and their clients look at what's happening to supply chains and how they're being transformed by technology.
Thank you, Daniel, for that, and congratulations also on your success and your journey. Roscoe, we'd love to learn more about you.
Yes, I'm Roscoe Carney. I currently work at the Shelter Park facility in Houston, Texas. I've been working in the supply chain field for 15 years, first starting out in the U.S. Navy. Then, after getting my MBA, I've been working in the oil and gas industry, construction industry, and also assisting small businesses in further developing their supply chains.
Awesome. Hey, Roscoe, thank you so much. Honored to have you here. Congratulations on everything. So let's get this teed up, gentlemen, shall we? Let's start off with the first question. From your perspective, how would you characterize how the global medical supply chain is working? And I'd love to get your guys' perspectives. I know you kind of look at things from different angles. So Dan, let's start with you. You're doing manufacturing yourself. Yeah. And you've been in healthcare a long time. Share with us your thoughts.
Well, it's been an issue, no question about it. Things have slowed down for sure, and it's forced us to relook at the way we do our business, candidly. We have to look at different opportunities for how to have supply distributed, whether it be from different countries. We have to do sort of the strategy that Intel did back in the 90s, where you build different products that can replace the other ones. So if we have one watch from China, which is not being properly distributed, maybe we get another China watch, maybe still from China, but a different watch that has a chance to be distributed more quickly. So you have to do that. You have to. It's become a whole different ballgame from the perspective of timing, and air freight or shipping freight. It's just so much uncertainty right now. If things were delayed for a period of time, and you knew it, and you knew how long that period of time was, you'd plan accordingly. But you just don't understand or know it. Maybe something takes 4 weeks to get here, and something takes 14 weeks to get here. And you have to, when you're building and you're distributing product, that's a very difficult proposition. So it has required us to have backups, shall we say, alternative ways of distributing alternative products to produce.
Wonderful. So Daniel, from your perspective, I mean, this is obviously an interesting time for you. I'm sure you're in great demand for your opinion. So I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on this.
That's the old Chinese curse, right? May you live in interesting times. And as Mr. Supply Chain, I'm feeling it now. It's a great question, Stephen. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is like 2 or 3 years ago, everybody took supply chain for granted. A lot of people had no idea what you meant when you said supply chain. And now all of a sudden everybody's saying, oh, supply chains are broken. They're not working. For me, though, I look at it and it's not one supply chain and it's not broken in one way. And so, I try to break it down to understand, well, what are the differences? How do we characterize that? For example, there have been lots of instances over the last 2 years where we've seen the demand for products go really high really quickly, even though the consumption didn't change, right? And toilet paper is a great example of that. And so people say the supply chain failed. Did it really? Or, was there just, the supply chain is designed to satisfy the needs of our customers. If our customers are buying irrationally and stockpiling, do we want our supply chains to be able to support that? So, I mean, that's sort of one failure mode that I've seen. And the truth is, you can't build enough capacity to keep up with that, nor should you. It would be a bad business choice, right? I've seen situations where demand went up a lot and consumption went up, but it's probably not going to be long-term consumption, right? And by the way, I think Peloton is probably a case study in that. They're scrambling to build capacity and make more bikes, forecasting out an irrational growth rate for way too long in the future. There's another scenario, though, where demand has gone up and consumption has gone up, right? So I'm thinking about things like N95 masks and hand sanitizer, where we're consuming more now than we were 3 years ago, right? For those things, genuinely, the supply chain needs to change. We need to increase manufacturing capacity. We need to be warehousing more. We need to be transporting more. Then there's a fourth category of supply chains or products where demand just went away. And for those things, the smart supply chain move is to shut down, right? Get rid of capacity, dump the inventory that you have. So I would say, supply chains are designed to satisfy the needs of customers. If the customers' needs change, then the supply chains need to adapt. No one should expect that to happen overnight. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of turbulence as all of those different kinds of supply chains rebalance to the new normal.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Roscoe, you're in the energy area. So, how do you think the global supply chain is working?
From the position of sitting, I guess, at an organization in the energy industry, and having, I guess, had previous experience in working with construction. So at the moment, the supply chain is working as Mr. Supply Chain has said. However, there are caveats to that, right? So the biggest caveats being plan on paying increased shipping costs, plan on planning even earlier, better integrate your demand planning. So not only, not looking at each component of the supply chain as interdependent, but actually looking at them as an entire system. So the biggest concern we have seen specifically in the energy industry is a lot of the strategic sourcing that we do overseas. So recently completing shipments for materials coming from China as well as India. And in those specific instances, we faced tremendous challenges associated with reliability of bookings, predictability of costs, and even previously, we were used to scheduling bookings and receiving confirmation of that booking in 1-2 days. And we're now seeing 1 to 2 weeks for confirmation of bookings. And then also, with that said, when you can't get equipment moved as you have desired to get moved and on the dates you've desired to have those moved at the costs you've desired, you then have to pay increased costs as well as have less predictability in terms of timing. So if you think about it, one cup overflowing to another cup as they become full, we're seeing instances where at the end of the day, there are 2 or 3 modes to move materials. There's ocean, ground, road transport, as well as air freight. So when given those choices of options, and especially if you're looking at international trade, at the end of the day, you really only have a couple options. And as that first cup overflows of ocean freight, when that capacity fills up, that spills over into other modes, specifically into the air freight. So we're seeing significant increases in cost as well as schedule reliability, and unfortunately having to bump materials from ocean freight to air freight in order to meet the required timelines, significantly bumping the cost associated with transportation.
I want to just jump in there because I heard you heard the word cost come up time and time again. And when you're in the business that I'm in, you're distributing product at a retail level to consumers or commercial, and that cost keeps bumping up, which indeed it has. It makes it very difficult for you to pass those costs on because you've already committed the deal in that respect. So it cuts into your profitability. And I've been in the financial side of the world for most of my career, and I've never had to deal with a planning issue of supply chains as much as I do currently. It just was always kind of taken for granted. And everything that Daniel said is, and Roscoe, I totally agree with. But in our case, it's how do you pass those costs on? You already have POs. It's hard to do that.
I was going to jump in and quantify a little bit about what Roscoe was saying. So, a lot of times what I'll use as an indicator is shipping from Shanghai to LA Long Beach in the US. That's a really sort of good indicator of what's happening in global trade. And, 3 years ago, you could book an ocean container, Shanghai to LA Long Beach. It would take less than 30 days, probably, 20-ish days, and it would cost $2,000 to $3,000. In 2022, right now, we're seeing situations where that container, instead of costing $2,000, will cost $20,000. And instead of taking 20 days, could get hung up at the port and sit there for 3 months. One of the things that's crazy about that is when ocean freight starts getting to these kinds of prices, normally air freight is about 10 times more expensive than ocean freight. But these days, ocean freight is so expensive that basically air freight is kind of cost competitive, which has allowed the air freight folks to push their fees up even higher. One other thing, just to add more chaos to the mix, when we think about air freight, a lot of people assume that we've got dedicated airplanes, that all they're doing is flying freight back and forth around the world. Actually, that's only about half of the air freight that we would normally send. The other half of our air freight capacity is what we call belly cargo. It's underneath the passengers in a passenger flight. So with COVID, as we've put all these travel restrictions in place and people have been reluctant to travel, the passenger airlines have cut their flights, which has diminished the amount of air freight capacity available in the marketplace. So we're having all these problems on the ocean side, which is making it harder to ship stuff and more expensive. We've got this diminished capacity on the air freight side, and it's just much harder and more expensive to move things than it was just a couple of years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the point that I was just going to interject to Dan's point was a lot of these cost increases on the supply chain are difficult to pass on to the customer. So you're really affecting, margins and impacting business in a different way. Even Amazon, made disclaimers in their stock report talking about how because of rising, energy cost and labor costs that their profitability is going to be impacted in the, months and, and years to come. So clearly this pandemic has affected businesses from all different sectors. Dan, you're in the healthcare, what's your thoughts on it? Is the healthcare supply chain getting impacted in unique and different ways than other supply chains?
I don't think it's in unique in different ways. It has been clearly affected, and I think Daniel noted some of it. When it comes to mask or PPE equipment, that's a little more straightforward. It's affected by that based on demand. But when you're talking about medical devices and the components associated with medical devices, of which there are numerous parts and pieces associated with it, each part has to be delivered to the manufacturer in time to keep that production line going. So when you're talking about supply chain, we think about toilet paper, we think about the mask, and we think about the testing, the COVID test, all right and proper. But those are singular materials for the most part, which are made and produced in one location that do not depend upon a lot of raw materials coming at them from different areas. You're talking about components that have chips in them or different technical features associated with it that come from different locations. It adds to supply chain. It's another feature that makes and causes things to be delayed. So the medical area has clearly been impacted, as has everyone else. The most obvious ones have been the mask and the testing, but you have to think beyond that. You have to think about actual devices and how they are made and the impacts from the production line associated with the raw materials needed to make those.
I think that's a great example, right? With toilet paper, you've only got a couple of ingredients that you need to make it. But when you start looking at complex engineered devices, whether that's medical equipment or automobiles or airplanes, I always used to joke, if a car has 30,000 parts and the supply chain isn't working for one of those parts, are you okay buying a car that only has 29,999, right? Because that you need all 30,000, right? So any one of them can break down the supply chain and shut down the factory, really, ultimately. And so the more complex the product, the more components it has in it, each of those essentially kind of makes the risk go up exponentially. So, I mean, it's not a linear increase. It's the more components you add, it becomes exponentially more difficult to manage that supply chain and ensure that you're going to have all of the parts you need when you need them. We've been so focused in the last few years on making supply chains more efficient, and we've been able to count on reliable transportation and reliable supply chain partners around the world. And because of that, we've been able to reduce inventories. And that's good because it increases efficiency. We can provide products to customers for a lower cost. We can be more profitable. But the problem now is we've got these complex products. The supply chains are not reliable. We don't have large safety stock inventories. And so when there is some kind of a disruption, all of a sudden, that one part that doesn't show up shuts down the whole supply chain from that point forward.
Sure.
Yeah. To your point, the violent shock to potentially an over-optimized system, right? So there's debate now, potentially have we gone too far in terms of optimizing the entire supply chain, ensuring that, just in time. So the second someone is taking a deodorant off the shelf at a Walmart, that gets replaced, right? And immediately then gets picked up by a customer. So that over-optimization to the point, to get to the point where it's just in time for the customer, that builds a pretty fragile system. As soon as you have some volatility, and a perfect example is the pandemic itself. sparking off in the form of a violent shock to that system that really has cascading effects to a system that has so many subcomponents. So not just the overall concept of, hey, this is just a ship that needs to go from point A to point B, from Shanghai to Port of LA, for example. But also taking into account that the global pandemic did affect some of our global manufacturing hubs, particularly China, and with a good 40% of containers being shipped trans-Pacific between China and the United States, that needless to say puts it at risk with those global manufacturing hubs shutting down, as well as other global manufacturing hubs. So it's not just the ships themselves; it's capacity at the port. It's anti-dumping laws associated, at least in the United States, anti-dumping laws associated with truck chassis. It's the number of truck drivers. So all those small percentages that folks talk about, like, hey, there's potentially 5% or 10% of truck drivers have left the market, or new ship build backlog has decreased by 3% or 2%. In and of themselves, those potentially aren't massive destruction to the supply chain, but put together, so all those subcomponents of that system, that gets pretty complex relatively quickly and can destroy the overall, or at least inject a significant amount of volatility into the supply chain.
Great points there, Roscoe.
You mentioned about over-optimizing, right? And that's what guys like you and I are doing all the time, is how do we optimize this supply chain? But really, what we tend to mean when we say optimize, we're optimizing for something. And what we're optimizing for tends to be profitability, right? So you eliminate anything that seems like waste, anything that you're not using all the time, any excess capacity. And that tends to create a highly efficient yet fragile system, right? It is also possible to optimize the supply chain for resilience, right? And it's just a matter of setting that as your KPI, right? It is the thing that is most important to us to ensure that the supply chain is resilient. In that case, we'll spend more money where we need to. We'll add flexibility where we need to. But it takes a different mindset for the folks that are investing in the business and the infrastructure to drive a focus towards resilience, or a focus towards efficiency, or to at least understand that there are often trade-offs between the two, and to recognize what those trade-offs are and what decisions they're making.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I really appreciate it. Roscoe, did you want to add something else?
Well, yeah, I think we'll see that in the short term as well as the mid and long term. We're going to reassess what is the correct number of how many widgets should we keep on the shelf. So there's going to be a complete reassessment in terms of the sizing of warehouses, the location of warehousing, how much hypercare we do to the supply chain itself. Luckily for folks like Mr. Supply Chain and myself, how many supply chain professionals to hire and how much to pay them. So impelled to the growth of the supply chain disruption, I think that if you graph the LinkedIn contacts that supply chain professionals are receiving right now from recruiters, I think those would overlay potentially with a bit of a lag, but overlay quite nicely. Just because at the moment, folks like Dan are saying, hey, how many folks do we have specifically assigned as subject matter experts to take a look at ocean freight options, to take a look at strategic sourcing, to find alternative sources of supply. So at the moment, there's a reassessment of all types of fundamentals or principles that we've operated on for 20 years, because we had that to some degree Big Mac index of the trans-Pacific shipment from Shanghai to Port of LA. And now that number, there are many professionals within healthcare as well as all other industries, I'm sure, that are having first time in career moments of shock where complete foregone conclusions about timing as well as costs associated with shipments has completely gone out the window. So there's a lot of folks right now that are a bit shell shocked and trying to figure out how to handle with this new, how to handle this new environment.
Well, you guys are getting more valuable by the minute, that's for sure. So I'm honored to have you guys here. So, a couple more things I wanted to cover. while we have this time. So we've talked about a lot of the problems and challenges. What is it going to take for things to get better, and how long is this going to last?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that because it would be a very, very important variable to put into my equation to figure out where things are headed. I just don't know the answer to that. I hope it's temporary, but it's causing great problems for businesses like ours because it brings such a level of uncertainty that it's absolutely impossible, not hard, it's impossible to manage the process now, whether it be in terms of cost or timing, or for that matter, even if you're going to have a product to ultimately sell. So I don't really know the answer to that. But when you're dealing with a foreign country, as we are, in our case, China, and we're counting on them to manufacture really the skin around our product, not the product itself, but the way it's delivered, the skin. And they ship it to wherever they ship it from in China, and now they're done. And now I have to figure out when's it going to get to the state, how long is it going to take, how much is it going to cost. Meanwhile, we have people wanting the product, and we've promised the product to them at a certain cost, and that cost now may become elevated because of the increased cost of shipping, or if we decide to do air transportation instead, because that is faster and not that much more expensive, candidly, sadly, or amazingly. So it's hard to answer those questions. It really makes it impossible for me to manage a business going forward with certainty of cost of product. You've committed a cost. I hope it's temporary. Even having supply chain people in our organization, which we do have, and working with them, they don't have the answers themselves. They're just working on a real-time basis, what's happening, and trying to address the real-time issue. So I'm going to repeat myself here, but all we're doing on our end is trying to find alternative ways to distribute, alternative products to distribute. We're building up our inventory, which there's a cost to that. You've got your cost of goods is sitting in inventory warehouse, and that's capital you're utilizing that you would otherwise want to use for developers or salespeople. Mm-hmm. So I don't have an answer to that question. We need one. I don't think we're going to get one. I hope it starts improving, but we have to work around that and try to make sure our business is protected in the best manner possible.
Absolutely. Mr. Supply Chain.
I'll give you an answer, but you won't like it. I think so. In supply chains, there's this principle that we call the bullwhip effect. And there's a ton of research around this issue. It's been studied really heavily. Basically, what the bullwhip effect describes is this behavior that when there's a small change in demand at the end of a supply chain, like the consumer buys a bit more or a bit less, those changes get amplified. They don't just get passed one by one through the steps up the supply chain. They get amplified at each step. And so particularly like we were talking about before with Dan and complex engineered products, right? If the consumer demand for a product goes up by 2x for 1 month, well, when you think about the impact that has on all the components that go into the products and their supply chains, there are a lot of ripples and a lot of steps and a lot of delays at every step, right? There may be a 1 month delay between each customer and each supplier, at least in that link. And they're all trying to plan ahead, build in manufacturing capacity, hire their staff, build inventory. All of that to say, if from this point forward, COVID ended, no more ships got stuck in the Suez Canal, we didn't have any more blizzards in Texas or pipelines shut down by cyber threats in the US, I think it is likely we'll still be seeing ripples 5 years from now. The reality is, I told you wouldn't want to hear it. The good news is, hey, supply chains can handle some of those ripples, right? The frequency and the amplitude of the problems will get smaller over time. So that's the good news. But the bad news is, do any of us really believe that nothing else is going to happen in the next 5 years so that things can level out again? I don't know. I mean, if that's the problem with black swans and unpredictable risks, right?
Roscoe?
Yes. So at least from a lot of communication with some of the market, the market players that give good insights into it. So we're talking about our freight forwarders, the steamship lines, our brokerage firms, those organizations, at least from communicating with them and understanding their perspective and their insights and what they're seeing. And of course, tremendous amount of caveats associated with it. The predictions are changing constantly. And like Mr. Supply Chain says, as soon as you make one prediction and there's another blizzard in Texas, that potentially throws a lot of those predictions out the window. So given that, and at least from speaking with those organizations, in the ocean freight world, the ocean freight universe, they're thinking, at least the general consensus is that there might be some relief looking at like Q4 of 24 or Q1 of 25. But again, that is constantly shifting out as more information becomes available. But so one thing that hopefully does at least put some peace in Dan's mind is that the recovery will be gradual. The improvements will be gradual, right? So it's not overnight. And of course, the question is, well, I want stuff to be correct or fixed overnight, right? But when we're looking at, if I tell you, hey, it's not going to get better until 2025 potentially, maybe we don't want it to be overnight. Maybe we do want it to be gradual, so we can see small improvements between now and then. So when let's say it is Q1 of 2025, remember a quarter before that, it may only be 10% worse than pre-pandemic, right? So it will be a gradual improvement, which means a couple things. One, it won't be nearly as bad towards the tail end as it is at the peak, which potentially we're at or near that. And also, I think what's most important, and Dan touched on this before, it's actually knowing, right? So what's most important is, at least I believe from an executive's position, is not necessarily whether it's going to be good or bad, but knowing that it's going to be good or bad, right? So the unknown is the problem. At least Dan can prepare if he knows how bad something's going to be. But if it's completely unknown, then needless to say, it's hard to predict for that and trying to prepare for it. So in conclusion, on that particular topic, and of course, I'm assuming this is what folks are most interested in, is when is this going to end? It's going to be gradual, right? So we'll be able to tell over time if we're improving, if we're moving in the right direction. And then general consensus, at least from the ocean freight and those types of folks that are looking at late 24, early 25, but lots and lots of assumptions associated with that. I think we've all had assumptions about what's going to happen as soon as we first heard about Omicron variant, and then 2 weeks later we had more information and those assumptions changed. 2 weeks later we had more information and those assumptions changed. So similar to that volatility, the folks that do have certain perspectives weigh in, but then they weigh in the next day with potentially something different. So
wonderful. Well, I unfortunately, with all these new variants, I just got some information today that there's several other variants that are in the queue, and it's a little disheartening, but
Well, with that said, can I revise my prediction?
Yeah, but I think to Dan's point earlier, being having resilience of the supply chain is going to be and redundancies and is going to be very, very important.
Stephen, I was going to throw one other thing on top of that, because one of the things that's important, it's not just about having more inventory. It's about having the right amount of additional inventory for the right components or the right products in the right places, right? Because just having inventory is expensive, as Dan was saying. You can't just have more of everything. You need to be smart about recognizing where the uncertainty is and how you're using inventory to give you flexibility, to give you options. And the one other point I wanted to make, there's an interesting conversation right now in the supply chain world where, we tend to think about there being a continuum between resilience and fragility, right? A supply chain on on one end is optimized towards efficiency, and then it's fragile. On the other side, it's optimized towards resilience, so it's not fragile. But perhaps there's another chunk on the other side of resilience, which is anti-fragility, meaning can we design supply chains in a way that when there's uncertainty, when there are disruptions, we can actually capitalize on that actually works to the advantage of our business. And it's a totally different way of thinking about supply chain and the role that we play in supporting our organizations and our customers.
Sure. So clearly, I think more and more countries are looking at global supply chain management as a matter of national security, clearly, and that there needs to be diversification of the global supply chain. And a lot of countries are trying to bring more manufacturing back to the United States and countries of origin, and I think there's going to be a bigger push towards that. So let me ask you.
I have to jump in on that one there. I hear that all the time. Just start manufacturing in the United States, and I'd love to do that. Believe me. But the expenses are so much higher. It's just you can't. It's just you can't ignore that fact that the expenses are literally threefold higher. To
but Dan, would people? I hear that if we made the chips, those special chips in the United States, which I guess they're going to start making them in Arizona here in a couple of years, they're building a huge factory. But if we made those chips in the United States and it added $2,000 to a car, okay, which is the numbers that I've heard. Again, it's just numbers I've heard. I mean, are people willing to pay more, for, more certainty in the supply chain? I mean, and I guess that's a question that we don't know yet, right? But I think it's something that a question that we have to ask.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I don't mean that. I totally agree with that. I'm not sure people are willing to pay more, candidly. And so I think it's just something we have to come to reality about. That it's easy to say, people are getting on the soapbox and say, start just manufacturing and building in the United States. Nobody would want that more than me. But when you look at the cost differential that exists, it's just a dramatic difference. And it's hard to ignore that. And you're competing against products that aren't doing that. So it's a difficult. I told you earlier that we're looking at different ways to produce product, different areas to produce product. And obviously the first place we wanted to look was the United States. And the difference in cost to manufacture in the United States versus where we're currently manufacturing was threefold. Not 30%, 300%.
Yeah, but Dan, what about? Let me just. Sorry, Daniel. Let me just add in here. So I think there's other options. Though I think Mexico. I'm hearing a lot more manufacturing is moving to Mexico. Yes. I've heard more is moving to Puerto Rico. Yes. So I know when I say manufacturing, I'm talking about really diversifying. A lot of the supply chain closer to home, not necessarily in the United States, but a lot closer. Sorry.
Totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. And those are the areas we're looking at. We're looking at Mexico and Puerto Rico, as a matter of fact, two areas we're considering and looking at to see if there's possibilities there. Absolutely.
Daniel?
Well, the thing I'd throw in, great conversation, by the way. And a key point here is we're talking about different kinds of supply chains and different steps of the supply chain and how some of them are more suited. So, for example, for Dan's products, it would be cost prohibitive to manufacture them in the US. It's too risky to manufacture them in China because it's just far away. So, what's that middle ground? Is there a place with a low cost of labor and low taxes where you can set up sophisticated manufacturing that's closer to where you'd be doing to where your consumer market is? In Roscoe's case, I think a lot of the manufacturing that they do, it probably has to be where it is because it's got to be close to the raw materials for refining. Another example is the semiconductors, Stephen. I mean, you mentioned that. The reality is a lot of that industry is controlled in Asia, but people forget something like 40% of all the semiconductor manufacturing in the world already occurs in the US. right? Moving more semiconductor manufacturing to the US doesn't diversify the supply chain, doesn't diversify the risk. It actually concentrates it. And semiconductor manufacturing specifically takes a lot of water. And you mentioned one of the places they're setting up new fabs is Phoenix, right? In the Southwest US, which already has issues with water scarcity. So, part of the argument that I would make is as we look at changing where we have manufacturing capacity and trying to source strategically, just moving things closer to home, which in our case is to the US, moving it closer to home doesn't eliminate your supply chain risks. It just changes the risks, right?
I agree, but let me just interject there. It's been clear that, there's been some geopolitical influences in the supply chain. I think you can't ignore that. And there's also, you can look at the unit cost for items, but there's also a risk associated with getting these products and getting the quality that you need, as Dan, talked about in this prelude there. So I think, I think you've got to, when you talk about cost, that's a whole discussion. Are you talking about unit cost? Are you talking about the total cost of, engaging in business? And in that, you've got to look at quality. You've got to look at fraud. You've got to look at other risk factors, So I think it's a lot broader discussion when we talk about costs. And it's something I'd love to talk to you guys more about, but we're running out of time. Let me get to the $1 million question here, okay? And this is a $1 million question. So if you could reimagine the global medical supply chain, if you had the whiteboard and you were going to start from scratch, and we're gonna take this global medical supply chain and just make it right. How do you reimagine this? How do we do this? So let me start with you, Dan. If you could kind of reimagine this, what would be helpful to you to kind of maybe mitigate? You're never going to eliminate, but mitigate some of the challenges.
Well, the biggest problem I see is in the bottlenecks that occur at the ships with the shipping, and primarily on the United States side is where I have seen it. And I think if there was a way to unlock that bottleneck, maybe by having more areas where shipping can be occurring from, rather than just one port or a couple of ports, have multiple ports. It seems ridiculous to me that you produce a product, you manufacture a product is delivered, and it's sitting outside a port, 5 miles from the United States port, and it's waiting and waiting and waiting. And then when it finally gets to the port, then you have to worry about how long it takes for it to get from the container to the truck. And again, it waits and waits and waits. And once it gets in the truck, well, now it's on its way. It's off to the warehouse. It's that bottleneck that's occurring at the port. So in my judgment, and I'm going to oversimplify this, I know, but multiple ports. We need more ports. We need more truckers. And we need a more efficient process of going from container to the truck. An easier, smoother process to get from container to truck. Mm-hmm. That's where, and I see the bottleneck occurring. I know I'm guilty of oversimplifying it, I'm sure, but that's where I see the problem occurring.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, Mr. Supply Chain.
I'm gonna take a little bit more philosophical view. Maybe look a little bit further down the road, because the thing for me is a supply chain exists to deliver value to a customer, right? What is it our customers need? And let's work backwards from that. And the thing that excites me about the medical world is personalized care, right? And so as we're developing like IoT technologies and better diagnostic tools and personalized treatment methods, it really seems to me like we're not that many years away from being able to deliver truly personalized, just-in-time healthcare, preventative care to people everywhere in the world. And I think, when you get to that level, that like you've got a device monitoring somebody's health in real time, you can identify deviations from the norm and have an intervention in place instantly or near instantly. That to me creates a need for an entirely different sort of supply chain and delivery model than, what I've seen in the US and what I've seen around the world. So, thinking about what's the role of the doctor in that process? What's the role of pharmacies? Are there new businesses that need to spring up, essentially like Amazon, to be able to deliver the devices, the medicine, the treatment that people need, where they are, when they are, in more or less real time? That for me is really where I see healthcare going in the not too distant future, and where healthcare supply chains need to follow.
Absolutely. And we've been working very closely on that, doing more testing in the homes, and everyone talks about COVID, but I think around diabetes and many other chronic conditions, taking the, healthcare to the patients in the homes or their place of work. I think that's going to be a big trend for sure.
Well, that's the business I'm in. That's exactly what we're doing. Taking making healthcare, have the front door of healthcare be there. That's exactly what we're doing. The problem though still is getting that product to the home,
right?
So they can use that product.
The last mile. Roscoe, I'd love to get your thoughts.
Certainly. So, and we've talked about this a bit, but and there was, of course, a discussion about manufacturing and global manufacturing hubs, bringing manufacturing back to the United States, etc. All fantastic goals, but in reality, at least in the short term, for the foreseeable future, low-cost country manufacturing and global manufacturing and global logistics, that is going to be a major component, right? That's not changing anytime soon. So with that said, rather than potentially saying, hey, we need to bring a lot of manufacturing to different locations, etc., we need to deal with what is reality today. And reality today, based on the infrastructure limitations that Dan touched on. So longer term, we can work on infrastructure improvements, right? So we can build new major ports. We can expand capacity of ports. We can build more cranes at the ports to be able to get the containers off the vessels. But in the short term, what is going to improve, at least what we're dealing with now, the beast we have now, is better planning, better communication, better visibility. So ultimately, the integrated demand planning piece, so having all the different components across the supply chain have information more readily available, and not only just having the information from a lagging perspective, right? Hey, last week was bad compared to the previous week. Getting to the point where we're not looking at history, but we're actually looking at the future, right? So once you do have the correct data in the system, right? Once you do have the correct information in the system, it's accurate, you're getting fed, potentially real time, et cetera. That's to the point where you can identify exceptions and you can identify outliers, and not necessarily after the fact, but actually say, hey, we were at 98% on-time delivery for this item, and our goal is 95 or above. So if it drops to 97 and then it drops to 96, hey, it's not bad yet, but it's bad, right? Because we're trending in the wrong direction. We're going to be in the wrong direction. We know next week is going to be a problem. Next month, et cetera, is going to be a problem, right? So based on the beast we have, we need to get, at least in my opinion, more into the analytics piece, more into the live visibility of seeing where materials are, more into supplier engagement with our suppliers. So pushing end-to-end communication and getting fed accurate information from their ERP programs, right? And linking up more and more systems so we can have visibility and then start to handle issues that we see coming ahead of us, and proactively identify those exceptions and correct them.
Yeah, well, Roscoe, I couldn't agree with you more. And really, innovation in the global medical supply chain is integration. And to your point, using data and technology, I think will go, a long way to getting the supply chain from an 8-track tape to hopefully an iPod, because I think the weaknesses of the supply chain certainly have been exposed and amplified during this, pandemic. So I want to thank everyone, Dan, Daniel, AKA Mr. Supply Chain, and Roscoe, for your participation today. I wanted to give you guys a quick opportunity. You're speaking in front of the world today. I don't know if there's any parting thoughts that you guys wanted to share with the world, but I wanted to, Dan, maybe start with you. If there's anything you wanted to share, I want to give you 30 seconds to kind of maybe leave with a parting thought.
Healthcare is changing. The delivery of healthcare is changing, and products like we're building and others as well are recognizing that healthcare has to be at the front door of your home, and that works. It makes perfect sense, but we can't let something like a ship container or freight issues prevent that from happening.
Well said, Mr. Supply Chain.
So it's critical for supply chains to work well. We need to have trust. We need to have communication. We need to have collaboration. And in a normal environment, we're so busy looking out after our own quarterly numbers and our own best interests that we often don't do a good job of being transparent and really letting our customers know, what's the real, what's going on here. And the same with our suppliers, right? We have a tendency to just beat up on them and whatever problems you're having, those are your problems. I place an order. You need to, provide my stuff. I think this is a really unique moment in time where we've all gone through this crisis together. We're all much more empathetic and sympathetic. And I think that really presents an opportunity in supply chains to have much more candid conversations, to be much more transparent. And I think that's really the companies and the executives that use that openness to build trust and to navigate these challenges collaboratively, not only are going to do a better job managing, the issues that I think are, we'll be seeing still at least for 5 years, but I actually think it's an opportunity to build long-term credibility and long-term relationships that will be a net positive for those companies and those executives when we finally get past this period.
I agree. Roscoe?
I think it is very, very important. And, sometimes I want to go to some of my colleagues and shake them by the lapels and say, hey, you really need to pay attention to this. What is happening in 2020 and 2021? This is not going to get fixed anytime soon. So with that said, there will be winners and there will be losers, and the winners will continue to win and the losers will lose or have to figure out how to recover. It's not going to get better anytime soon. Attention has to be paid to this. And if folks don't, aggressively try to get ahead of this and understand it, and to the point of both Dan and Daniel, aka Mr. Supply Chain, communication, trust, collaboration with all of the components across the overall supply chain. So having more conversations about on-time delivery, having more candid promise dates for fulfilling POs, having more candid conversations about how much does working capital cost, right? That's one of the biggest hidden costs is the carrying costs associated with materials and warehouse, which I'm sure Dan knows intimately about, but a lot of other folks within organizations don't appreciate, and they say, hey, we need to keep this old inventory or this inefficient X, Y, or Z, right? So having very honest, candid discussions and really focusing on the fundamentals of supply chain. So get with your supply chain professionals and understand what are the risks, because for so long we've kind of been sitting in the back, just the back of the offices, less with less engagement because everything was working smoothly. Well, it's not working smoothly anymore. So let's have conversations about how we can jump in and try to get our hands around it.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Dan, Mr. Supply Chain, and Roscoe for your time and your participation and your insights today. Roscoe, I just wanted to say, and dovetailing into Mr. Supply Chain, I think that the pandemic has really showed that we're all connected, more connected in ways than we ever thought. And if this part of the world's good and this part of the world is not good, we're not good. So to your point about collaborations, I think one thing we're all going to need to do And in the spirit here of the World Expo, we're talking about connecting minds and talking about solving some of the greatest challenges of the world. I think we need to have these higher level of discussions and kind of put aside some of these geopolitical, differences. Otherwise it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot longer to get past some of these challenges. It's hard enough right now. So we need to, collaborate at a much higher level than we have. And I just wanted to kind of end with a quote from Abraham Lincoln. And he said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think, in the spirit of the World Expo, we really need to come together and find ways to have a higher level of dialogue and discourse so we can solve some of these challenges, because they're not going to go away on their own. So I'm grateful for everyone's time on the panel. I'm grateful for everyone that listened to this, and we're very, very hopeful that we can continue this discussion, and many blessings to you and your families, and really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.